My name is Elara Voss. I'm 31 years old, and for the first time in years, I finally felt like I had life under control. I'd worked tirelessly to build a career as a graphic designer, crafting bold visuals for brands while managing deadlines that felt impossible. But it was worth it because, at the end of each long day, I could return to my little sanctuary, my apartment. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every plant basking in the sunlight of the bay window, it all reflected me. I'd built this place from scratch after years of sharing cramped spaces with roommates who seemed to think boundaries were a suggestion. So when I handed the spare key to my younger sister, Lyric, I'll admit, I hesitated. Lyric had always been the wild card in our family. She was 4 years younger, brimming with charm and mischief, the type of person who could talk her way out of anything. Growing up, she would borrow my clothes without asking, then spin a story so convincing I'd end up apologizing for accusing her. She had a way of turning every situation in her favor, and to her credit, it often worked. But as I stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand and a conference waiting for me in another city, I convinced myself it would be fine. "Just a couple of nights," she'd said, her voice sweet but casual, "until I sort something out. Thanks, Elara. You're a lifesaver." I gave her the key, reassured by her promise that she'd leave everything exactly as she found it. After all, she was my sister. What could go wrong? The conference flew by in a blur of presentations, late-night networking, and coffee-fueled mornings. I didn't hear much from Lyric during the week, but I didn't think twice about it. That was just how she was, popping in and out of my life like a breeze, leaving moments of chaos in her wake, but always harmless in the end. At least, that's what I told myself. But the moment I opened my apartment door, I knew something was wrong. The familiar scent of lavender from my diffuser was gone, replaced by the faint smell of cigarettes and something else I couldn't place. My cozy, minimalist living room had been transformed into a cluttered mess of mismatched furniture and random knickknacks that weren't mine. A pile of clothes I didn't recognize was heaped in the corner, and my beloved vintage coffee table, the one I spent months hunting down, was scratched and covered with empty mugs and plates. I froze in the doorway, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Lyric?" I called out, my voice shaky but firm. "Hey, you're back." Her voice floated out from the kitchen, cheerful and unbothered. A moment later, she appeared, holding a mug in one hand and a bag of chips in the other. She looked completely at ease, like this was her space and I was the intruder. "What is all this?" I demanded, gesturing around the room. "What happened to my stuff?" Lyric shrugged, tossing a chip into her mouth. "Oh, I packed some of it up. It didn't really work with the vibe I was going for." "The vibe you were going for?" My voice rose, disbelief choking me. "Lyric, this is my apartment." Her smile faltered just for a second before she recovered. "Not anymore," she said lightly, as if she were announcing the weather. "I told the landlord you moved out. I have the lease in my name now." I stared at her, the words not registering at first. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. What? "You were gone for a week," she said, brushing past me to plop down on the couch. "It's not like you were using the place, and I needed somewhere stable, you know? It all worked out perfectly." Her casual tone made my blood boil. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. My stomach twisted as I glanced around the room, spotting boxes labeled with my name shoved carelessly into a corner. My life, packed away like an afterthought. "Lyric, this is insane," I said, my voice trembling. "You can't just—" "Oh, come on, Elara," she interrupted, rolling her eyes. "You've always been the responsible one, the one who has it all together. You'll be fine. Let me have this, just for a little while. You'll thank me later." I didn't even recognize the person sitting in front of me. My sister had always been impulsive, but this was something else, calculated, selfish, and utterly dismissive of the fact that she was tearing my life apart. My home, my sanctuary, gone. And in that moment, as anger and disbelief churned in my chest, one thought rose above the chaos. I wouldn't let her get away with this. I didn't say another word. I turned on my heel and walked out, my heart pounding in my chest. Outside, the cold evening air hit me like a slap, but it did nothing to clear the haze of anger and confusion clouding my mind. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through my contacts. Who could I call? My landlord? The police? A lawyer? Each option felt overwhelming, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't letting this go. I ended up calling my best friend, Marin. Marin had been my anchor for years, the one person who could always talk me off the ledge when life got messy. The moment she answered, I didn't even bother with pleasantries. "You won't believe what Lyric's done this time," I said, my voice breaking. "Uh-oh," Marin replied, her tone shifting to concern. "What happened?" I launched into the story, pacing the sidewalk as I explained how Lyric had moved into my apartment, changed the lease, and boxed up my belongings as if I were a stranger. I could practically hear Marin's jaw drop on the other end of the line. "She did what?" Marin exclaimed. "Elara, that's not just shady, it's illegal. You can't let her get away with this." "I know," I said, pressing a hand to my forehead, "but I don't even know where to start. She's got the lease in her name now, and she's acting like I'm the one who's crazy." Marin sighed. "Okay, first of all, breathe. You're not crazy. Lyric's just, well, Lyric. But this is serious, Elara. You need to figure out exactly what she's done and how she did it. Start with the landlord. If she forged documents or lied, they need to know." She was right. Of course she was right. But the thought of unraveling the mess Lyric had created felt exhausting. Still, there was no other choice. "Thanks, Marin," I said, my voice steadier now. "I'll handle it." The next morning, I headed straight to my landlord's office. The normally cheerful receptionist looked uneasy as I approached the desk, as if she knew exactly why I was there. "Hi, I need to speak to Mr. Roth about my apartment," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. The receptionist hesitated before nodding. "He's expecting you," she said, motioning me toward his office. That struck me as odd. Expecting me? I hadn't even called ahead. When I stepped into Mr. Roth's office, his expression confirmed my worst fears. He looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact as he gestured for me to sit. "Elara," he began, his tone cautious. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." "What's going on, Mr. Roth?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Why is my sister living in my apartment, and why is the lease in her name?" He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Your sister came to me last week," he said. "She told me you had taken a job out of state and that you'd asked her to take over the lease. She even had a signed letter from you authorizing the transfer." I felt my stomach drop. "What letter?" "I didn't sign anything." Mr. Roth opened a file on his desk and slid a piece of paper toward me. My heart sank as I scanned the page. There it was, my signature, forged so convincingly that even I might have believed it was real. "She showed me this and provided all the necessary paperwork," he continued. "It seemed legitimate, Elara. I'm sorry, but I had no reason to doubt her." My hands shook as I clutched the paper. This wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate fraud. And Lyric had done it so smoothly, so confidently, that no one had questioned her for a second. "Mr. Roth," I said, forcing myself to speak evenly, "this document is fake. I didn't authorize anything. She forged my signature." His face paled. I didn't realize. I'll have to look into this further, but if what you're saying is true, we'll need to take immediate action." I nodded, a spark of determination igniting within me. "Thank you. Please let me know what you find. And in the meantime, I'm going to handle this." As I left the office, clutching the forged letter like a piece of evidence in a crime scene, a plan began to form in my mind. Lyric had crossed a line this time, and I wasn't just going to get my apartment back. I was going to make sure she regretted ever thinking she could take it from me. I spent the rest of the day piecing together every shred of evidence I could find. My mind raced as I combed through emails, lease agreements, and text messages, looking for anything that could prove Lyric had pulled this stunt. The forged letter Mr. Roth had shown me was just the tip of the iceberg. If Lyric had gone this far, I had no doubt there were more lies buried beneath the surface. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table in my best friend Marin's apartment, surrounded by a mess of papers and a growing sense of frustration. Marin hovered nearby, her arms crossed and her face set in a look of grim determination. "Okay, let's go over this again," Marin said, pulling a chair next to me. "Lyric somehow convinced your landlord to switch the lease by pretending to be you. She forged your signature, made up a story, and now she's got legal possession of your apartment. What else are we missing?" I rubbed my temples, exhausted but unwilling to give up. "I don't know. I feel like I'm chasing a ghost. She's been so careful, Marin. She even packed up all my things so it looks like I really moved out." Marin leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "What about your mail? Credit cards? Bank statements? If she's as bold as we think, she might have gone after more than just your apartment." Her words sent a chill down my spine. My mail. I hadn't even thought about it. Lyric had access to my mailbox. She could have intercepted everything while I was out of town. What if she'd used my identity for something even worse? I didn't waste another second. Grabbing my laptop, I logged into my bank account and scanned through my recent transactions. At first, everything looked normal, but then I saw it. A series of charges I didn't recognize. Restaurants I'd never visited, online stores I'd never shopped at, and a particularly large withdrawal that left my account dangerously low. My stomach twisted in knots. "She's been using my credit card," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Marin's eyes widened. "What?" "Elara, this isn't just fraud. It's identity theft. You need to report this right now." I nodded, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. "I will. But first, I need to confront her. She's not going to get away with this." Marin grabbed my arm, stopping me. "Are you sure that's a good idea? She's already proven she'll do whatever it takes to cover her tracks. If you confront her without a plan, she might twist things around or worse, make an even bigger mess." She was right. Lyric was a master manipulator. If I stormed in without evidence and strategy, she'd find a way to turn the tables on me, just like she always did. I needed to be smarter than her this time. "What do I do then?" I asked, my voice laced with desperation. Marin gave me a reassuring smile. "You've already started. You've got the forged letter, the fraudulent charges, and Mr. Roth on your side. Keep gathering evidence, build an airtight case. Then, when you confront her, she won't have anywhere to run." I let out a shaky breath, nodding. "You're right. I'm going to nail her for this. She's not just taking my apartment, she's trying to ruin my life. Over the next few days, I worked tirelessly to build my case. I filed disputes with my bank, contacted a lawyer, and even reached out to a friend who worked in tech to recover deleted texts from my old phone. Piece by piece, I uncovered more of Lyric's web of lies. She hadn't just stolen my apartment. She'd used my identity to apply for credit cards, buy expensive clothes, and even book a weekend trip under my name. By the time I was done, I had a stack of undeniable evidence. My anger had transformed into a cold, calculated resolve. Lyric thought she could take from me without consequences, but she was about to learn just how wrong she was. When I finally walked back into my apartment, I felt no fear, no hesitation. Lyric was lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if she didn't have a care in the world. She looked up when she saw me, her expression smug. "Back already?" she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I thought you'd be gone longer." I dropped my bag on the floor and stared at her, my voice steady and calm. "We need to talk." Lyric smirked, clearly amused. "Oh, this should be good. What's it about this time?" "It's about you," I said, my gaze locked on hers, "and how you're going to pay for every single thing you've done." Lyric's smirk faltered for a moment before she quickly masked it with feigned indifference. "What are you talking about, Elara?" she asked, her tone breezy but her eyes narrowing. "You're being so dramatic." I stepped further into the apartment, my expression cold and unyielding. "Let's drop the act, Lyric. I know everything. The forged letter, the credit card charges, the fraud. I've got all the evidence I need, and trust me, it's not going to end well for you." Her face froze for a moment, her mouth opening as if to respond, but no words came out. Then, just as quickly, she recovered, letting out a dry laugh. "You're unbelievable. Evidence? Fraud? Do you hear yourself? You're always looking for a reason to paint me as the bad guy." I crossed my arms, unfazed. "You don't have to paint yourself, Lyric. You did that all on your own. Want to see the proof?" I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder, tossing it onto the coffee table in front of her. "Take a look. Bank statements, the fake lease agreement, even the charges under my name. It's all there." She stared at the folder, her hands twitching slightly as though she wanted to grab it, but didn't want to give me the satisfaction. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she muttered. "You're always so uptight about everything. It's just money. You'll get over it." "Just money?" My voice rose, anger finally breaking through my calm exterior. "You stole from me, Lyric. My apartment, my bank account, my identity. Do you even understand how serious this is? Or do you just not care?" Lyric stood abruptly, her face flushing with anger. "You think you're so perfect, don't you?" she snapped. "Always the responsible one, the one who has it all together. You've never had to struggle the way I have. You don't know what it's like to feel desperate." I took a step closer, my voice low but firm. "Struggling doesn't give you the right to destroy someone else's life. I would have helped you, Lyric. I always have. But this is beyond anything I can forgive." Her defiance wavered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. "So what?" she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You're going to turn me in? Ruin me? Is that what you want?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "What I want is my life back, and you're going to give it to me." Her shoulders slumped slightly, the bravado slipping away. "And if I don't?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I let the police and the courts handle it," I said simply. "Your choice, Lyric. Either you make this right, or you deal with the consequences." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. The room was heavy with silence, the weight of my words sinking in. Finally, she sank back onto the couch, her face pale and drawn. "Fine," she muttered. "What do you want me to do?" I pulled up a chair and sat across from her, my expression resolute. "First, you're going to pack up your things and leave. Then, you're going to call the landlord and tell him the truth. After that, you're going to reimburse me for every cent you stole." She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. "And if you try anything at all, I'll go straight to the police. Do you understand me?" She nodded reluctantly, her gaze dropping to the floor. For the first time, she looked defeated, and though a small part of me felt a pang of guilt, I knew this was the only way. Lyric needed to face the consequences of her actions, not just for my sake, but for her own. As she began gathering her things, the weight on my chest started to lift. I wasn't naive enough to think this was the end of it. Lyric was unpredictable, and there was no telling what she might do next. But for now, I had my home back, my life back. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally in control. The following morning, I woke to the sound of silence in my apartment. It was an odd feeling after the chaos Lyric had left behind. She had packed her things in a flurry of resentment the night before, her every movement filled with muttered complaints and bitter glares. When she slammed the door behind her, I felt the weight of weeks of stress begin to dissipate. But as much as I wanted to breathe easy, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. I spent the day meticulously restoring my apartment to the way it was before Lyric had turned it into her personal disaster zone. I unpacked the boxes she had shoved my belongings into, each item a small reminder of the life I had built and almost lost. My vintage coffee table bore deep scratches I couldn't buff out, and one of my favorite paintings was missing, likely pawned or sold. It stung, but I pushed the anger aside. There were bigger battles ahead. By mid-afternoon, I sat down with my laptop and began organizing everything I had collected. Bank records, fraudulent credit card charges, the forged lease agreement, all neatly categorized in a folder I labeled Lyric Case. It felt strange, compiling a case against my own sister, but she had crossed so many lines that it no longer felt like a choice. It was a necessity. As I worked, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. Hesitating for only a moment, I answered. "Elara Voss?" a deep male voice asked. "Yes, this is she," I replied cautiously. "This is Officer Daniels with the City Fraud Division. We received the report you filed regarding identity theft, and I wanted to follow up on a few details." My heart skipped a beat. The report I'd filed at Marin's insistence was meant to be a backup, a safety net if Lyric didn't follow through on her promises. Hearing from an actual officer made everything feel far more real. "I'm happy to help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Officer Daniels asked a series of questions about the fraudulent charges and the forged lease. He was thorough, but his tone was kind, as if he sensed the personal toll this was taking on me. When we finished, he paused before continuing. "Ms. Voss, I have to ask, do you believe the perpetrator in this case poses an ongoing threat? It seems like this wasn't an isolated incident." I hesitated. My instinct was to protect Lyric, to shield her from the fallout she had so recklessly invited. But then I thought about everything she had done. The lies, the theft, the utter disregard for how it would affect me. She needed to be held accountable, or this cycle would never end. "Yes," I said finally. "I believe she could do this again. She's already caused so much damage." Officer Daniels thanked me for my honesty and assured me they would proceed carefully. As I hung up, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Lyric had left my apartment, but she hadn't left my life. Not yet. Later that evening, I received a text from her. It was short and sharp, dripping with bitterness. "You didn't have to involve the cops. You've made your point. I hope you're happy." I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, to remind her that she had left me no choice. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Lyric would always see herself as the victim, twisting the truth to fit her narrative. So instead, I locked my phone and turned away. Over the next week, the legal process began to unfold. The landlord, Mr. Roth, worked with me to nullify the fraudulent lease, and the bank issued a temporary credit for the stolen funds while they investigated. The police subpoenaed Lyric's bank statements, and as more evidence came to light, her web of deceit grew larger than I'd imagined. She hadn't just used my identity, she had used others too, weaving a trail of fraud and manipulation that stretched far beyond me. It was devastating to realize just how far she had fallen, but it also solidified my resolve. Lyric needed help, real help, but it wasn't something I could give her. She had to face the consequences of her actions, even if it meant the bond between us would never be the same. The final confrontation came unexpectedly. I was at home, piecing my life back together one small step at a time, when there was a knock at my door. Opening it, I found Lyric standing there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes rimmed with red. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to say no. But against my better judgment, I stepped aside, letting her into the space she had once tried to claim as her own. She sat on the edge of the couch, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, she said, "I messed up." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the closest thing I'd ever heard from her. I sat across from her, waiting for her to continue. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad," she said, her voice breaking. I don't know what I thought. That you'd forgive me? That it wouldn't matter? But now the police are involved, and I don't know what to do." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret and fear. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her armor, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but another part, the part that had been betrayed and hurt so deeply, couldn't forget what she had done. "You're right," I said finally. "You messed up, and now you have to face the consequences. I can't fix this for you, Lyric. You have to take responsibility." Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might argue, might try to shift the blame like she always did. But instead, she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I'll try," she whispered. As she left that evening, I felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and a faint glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the wake-up call she needed. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn her life around. But whether she did or not, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't let her drag me down again. This time, I was choosing myself, and that made all the difference. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle back into something resembling normalcy. My apartment slowly returned to its former state, though some things were beyond repair. The scratches on the coffee table remained, as did the faint smell of smoke that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. But these imperfections became symbols of something deeper, reminders of the strength I'd found in standing up for myself, even against my own sister. the legal process moved forward steadily. Lyric was officially charged with identity theft and fraud, though the judge allowed her to enter a diversion program in lieu of jail time. It was a small mercy, one that I hoped would lead her to seek the help she so desperately needed. I wished I could say the outcome brought me peace, but it was more complicated than that. There were days when I missed the good moments with Lyric, the rare times she'd been the fun, carefree sister who could light up a room. But those moments were fleeting, buried under years of manipulation and betrayal. Maren was my constant source of support through it all. One evening, as we shared a bottle of wine at her apartment, she raised her glass and smiled at me. "To taking your life back," she said. I clinked my glass against hers, a genuine smile tugging at my lips. To never letting anyone steal it again. Despite the challenges, I began to rebuild not just my apartment, but also my sense of self. I started journaling, pouring out years of suppressed emotions and unspoken frustrations. The act of writing became cathartic, a way to process the pain while also rediscovering my own strength. I even reached out to a therapist, something I'd been hesitant to do in the past. Talking about my relationship with Lyric and the boundaries I needed to establish helped me see things more clearly. One evening, as I was rearranging the books on my shelves, I found an old photo tucked between the pages of a journal. It was of Lyric and me as kids, sitting on the swings in our backyard, grinning from ear to ear. I held the photo for a long time, the memories of simpler times washing over me. I wasn't ready to forgive her, not fully, but I wasn't ready to let go of the hope that she could change either. Carefully, I placed the photo in a small frame and set it on the shelf next to my favorite books. It wasn't a gesture of reconciliation, but rather a reminder of where we'd come from and the potential for something better in the future. Weeks turned into months, and life moved forward. I poured myself into my work, taking on projects that reignited my passion for design. I even started volunteering at a local community center, helping young artists find their creative voices. It felt good to give back, to channel my energy into something meaningful. As for Lyric, our contact was minimal. She sent me occasional updates through text, brief, almost clinical messages about her progress in the diversion program and the steps she was taking to get her life back on track. I replied when I could, keeping my responses polite but distant. I wasn't ready to let her back into my life, but I wasn't shutting the door entirely either. One day, I received a longer message from her. It was an apology, messy, imperfect, and riddled with self-doubt, but genuine nonetheless. She wrote about how the experience had forced her to confront the damage she'd caused, not just to me, but to herself as well. She didn't ask for forgiveness, only understanding. I sat with the message for a long time, letting her words sink in. I didn't reply right away. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something that could be rushed. It would take time, and it would depend on her actions, not just her words. But the fact that she'd reached out, that she'd acknowledged her mistakes, felt like a small step in the right direction. That evening, I sat on my couch with a cup of tea, watching the city lights twinkle through the window. My apartment was finally my own again, a reflection of who I was and who I was becoming. And though the scars of the past remained, they no longer felt like burdens. They felt like proof of my resilience. As I sipped my tea, I allowed myself a moment of quiet hope. Maybe Lyric and I would find our way back to each other someday. Maybe not. Either way, I knew I'd be okay, because for the first time in a long time, I was putting myself first, and that was a choice I would never regret. Months passed, and life continued to unfold with a sense of stability I hadn't experienced in years. I poured myself into my work, relishing the calm that came with having clear boundaries and control over my life. It wasn't just my apartment that felt different. It was me. I had grown in ways I didn't fully realize until moments of challenge arose, and I found myself handling them with strength and clarity that would have eluded me before. One afternoon, I received an unexpected email. It was from Lyric, and the subject line read simply, "Thank you." I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what I would find. Her messages over the past few months had been sporadic and careful, mostly updates about her progress in the diversion program and her plans to move forward. But this one felt different, more personal. "Elara, I've been sitting with a lot of thoughts lately, and I realized there's something I haven't said outright. Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I made it nearly impossible to believe I could change. I know I put you through hell, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about how much I hurt you. There's no excuse for what I did, but I want you to know that I'm working every day to be better, not just for you, but for myself. The program has been hard, but it's also been eye-opening. I've started therapy, and I'm learning things about myself I never wanted to face before. It's not easy, but it's helping. I don't expect forgiveness, Elara, and I don't expect us to go back to how things were. I just hope that one day you can see me as someone who's trying to make things right. You deserved better from me, and I'm sorry I didn't give you that. Thank you for standing your ground and for forcing me to confront the mess I made of my life. It saved me, even if it didn't feel like it at the time." Lyric. I sat there, staring at the email for what felt like an eternity. It was the first time I'd ever seen Lyric take full accountability for her actions. The words felt raw and unpolished, but they also felt sincere. For the first time, I saw a version of her that I hadn't seen in years, a version that wanted to change. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I closed my laptop and took a long walk through the city, letting the words replay in my mind. Part of me wanted to believe her, to trust that this was the turning point she had always needed. But another part of me remained guarded, wary of letting her back into my life too quickly. As I walked, I found myself reflecting on our childhood, on the moments that had shaped us both in different ways. Lyric and I had always been opposites. Me, the responsible one who played by the rules. Her, the rebellious free spirit who seemed to thrive on chaos. But beneath the differences, there had once been a bond, a shared understanding that only sisters could have. Somewhere along the way, we had lost that. Maybe now, there was a chance to rebuild it, not as it was, but as something new. When I returned home, I opened the email again and read it once more. This time, I allowed myself to feel the emotion behind her words, the vulnerability she had rarely shown. Slowly, I began to type a response. Lyric, thank you for your message. It means a lot to hear you say these things, and I can see how much effort you're putting into making changes. I won't lie, this has been one of the hardest experiences of my life, and it's going to take time for me to fully process everything. But I'm glad to see you taking responsibility and working on yourself. That's all I've ever wanted for you. I hope you continue on this path, not just for me, but for yourself. You deserve a chance at a better life, Lyric. I'll always be rooting for you, even from a distance. Take care, Elara. I hit send and exhaled deeply, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over me. I didn't know what the future held for Lyric or for our relationship, but I did know this. I had done everything I could. The rest was up to her. That night, I curled up on my couch with a book and a cup of tea, the city lights casting a soft glow through the window. My apartment felt more like home than ever, a place of peace, of safety, and of growth. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel proud of how far I had come. Whatever happened next, I knew I was ready for it, because I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving, and that was a victory no one could take from me. The days following my email exchange with Lyric were surprisingly calm. There was no dramatic response, no immediate attempt to reinsert herself into my life, which I appreciated more than I realized I would. It was as though she understood, maybe for the first time, that I needed space to heal. And in that silence, I found a sense of clarity that had eluded me for years. One weekend, I decided to visit my parents. We hadn't spoken much about what had happened with Lyric, mostly because I wasn't ready to dive into their inevitable questions, or worse, their attempts to mediate. But I felt strong enough now to face their concerns and to stand firm in my boundaries, no matter what they might say. The familiar scent of my mother's lavender candles greeted me as I stepped inside their home. My father was in his usual spot on the recliner, glasses perched on his nose as he flipped through a newspaper. My mother bustled out of the kitchen, a warm smile lighting up her face when she saw me. "Elara, sweetheart, it's so good to see you," she said, pulling me into a hug. "It's good to see you too, Mom," I replied, feeling a pang of guilt for how distant I'd been lately. But then again, I needed that distance to survive the whirlwind Lyric had created. As we sat down for dinner, the conversation started light. Work, city life, a few anecdotes from my parents about their retired neighbors. But eventually, as I knew it would, the topic shifted. "Have you heard from Lyric?" my father asked, his tone carefully neutral but his eyes watchful. I took a sip of water, gathering my thoughts. "Yes, I've heard from her. She's working through the diversion program and getting therapy." My mother's brow furrowed, her fork pausing midair. "Is she okay?" "She mentioned she was struggling when we spoke last." I nodded. "She's trying. I think this experience has been a wake-up call for her." My father cleared his throat, setting his glass down. "And for you? How are you holding up after everything?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know how to answer, but because I wanted to be honest in a way I hadn't been before. "I'm better," I said finally. "It's been hard, but I've learned a lot about myself through this. I've set boundaries I never thought I'd be able to. I'm proud of where I am now." My mother reached across the table to squeeze my hand, her expression softening. "We're proud of you too, Elara, and we're here for you, no matter what." It wasn't the deep, dramatic conversation I'd feared. Instead, it was simple, supportive, and just what I needed to hear. For the first time in years, I felt like my family was on my side, not trying to fix things, but letting me handle them in my own way. As I drove back to the city that evening, my mind wandered to Lyric. I didn't know if she'd found the same clarity I had, but I hoped she was at least moving in that direction. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel a cautious optimism about her future. Over the next few months, our contact remained sporadic, but each message she sent showed small signs of progress. She told me about her therapy sessions, her attempts to find steady work, and even her plans to volunteer at a local shelter to give back in some way. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments where her tone slipped into self-pity or defensiveness. But it was a start. One evening, I received a message from her that surprised me. It was simple, but it carried a weight I didn't expect. Elara, I've been thinking about everything you've done for me. I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful. I'm going to keep trying to be better. For real this time. Thank you for not giving up on me completely. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. Finally, I typed back. I'll always hope for the best for you, Lyric. Keep working on yourself. It's the best thing you can do, for you and everyone else. As I hit send, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. This wasn't the perfect happy ending I might have hoped for years ago, but it was real. It was honest. And most importantly, it was enough. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't weighed down by guilt or responsibility. Lyric's journey was her own, and mine was mine. And as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, sipping tea and watching the city lights twinkle, I realized something. I was free. Free to live, to thrive, and to keep building the life I deserved. And that was the best ending I could have asked for. Life carried on, and with each passing day, the distance between me and the chaos Lyric had brought into my life grew wider. It wasn't that I forgot everything. I couldn't. But the sting of betrayal softened into something else. Understanding, acceptance, and strangely, hope. Months turned into a year, and the changes in my life became more tangible. My work flourished as I landed bigger projects and earned a promotion that brought both new challenges and new rewards. I even began taking art classes on the weekends, rekindling a love for painting that I'd pushed aside during the whirlwind of recent years. My apartment became more than just a home. It became my sanctuary again. A space where I could breathe, reflect, and create. One crisp autumn morning, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unmistakably Lyric's. My heart quickened as I carefully opened it, unfolding the paper inside. Her words were neat but deliberate, as if she'd taken great care in crafting them. Dear Elara, I know this letter might surprise you. I've been thinking a lot about the past year and everything that's happened between us. I've realized there are some things that can't be said in a text or an email, so I decided to write them down instead. First, I want to say thank you. Thank you for standing up to me when I couldn't even see how far I'd fallen. Thank you for refusing to let me drag you down, even though it would have been easier to look the other way. You've always been the strong one, Elara, even when I made you doubt yourself. I see that now, and I'm sorry for every time I took advantage of your kindness. I won't pretend that everything is perfect in my life. I'm still working on myself, and I probably will be for a long time. But I'm trying, really trying, to be better. I've got a steady job now, and I've been volunteering at the shelter twice a week. It's not much, but it feels like a start. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I don't expect us to ever go back to the way things were. But I hope someday we can build something new. I miss having you in my life, Elara, not because of what you can do for me, but because you're my sister. And I love you, even if I haven't always shown it. Take care of yourself. You deserve every bit of the happiness you've built. Love, Lyric. I read the letter twice, the words sinking in slowly. This wasn't like the quick texts or surface-level updates she'd sent before. This felt real, raw even. For the first time, I saw a version of Lyric who wasn't just apologizing to make amends, but was genuinely working to rebuild her life. It didn't erase the pain she'd caused, but it gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, she was finally on the right path. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I let the letter sit on my desk, returning to it over the next few weeks whenever I found myself questioning how far we'd come. It reminded me of the resilience we both had in different ways and of the complicated bond that tied us together, even through the worst of times. Eventually, I wrote her back. My letter was cautious but honest, acknowledging the progress she'd made while setting clear boundaries about what I needed to feel safe and respected. I wasn't ready to invite her fully back into my life, but I left the door open, a small crack, enough to let in the possibility of something new. The next time we saw each other, it wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was a quiet meeting at a coffee shop where we talked about neutral topics like work, hobbies, and the shelter where she volunteered. There were no accusations, no lingering bitterness, just two sisters trying to navigate a relationship that had been broken but not entirely lost. As I walked away from that meeting, I felt lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because I knew we were both trying. And for now, that was enough. Looking back, I realized this journey wasn't just about Lyric. It was about me. It was about learning to stand up for myself, to set boundaries, and to reclaim my life in ways I hadn't thought possible. Lyric's choices had forced me to grow, to fight for what I deserved, and to rediscover my own strength. And for that, in a strange way, I was grateful. In the end, life is messy. Relationships are complicated, and forgiveness isn't always straightforward. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that even in the mess, there's room for growth, for healing, and for hope. And sometimes that's all you need to keep moving forward. Time moved forward, carrying with it the quiet hum of a new normal. My life had found a steady rhythm, one that felt fulfilling and peaceful. I embraced it fully, immersing myself in my work, hobbies, and the connections I had nurtured with people who added value to my life. And though I had learned to keep a safe distance from Lyric, our occasional interactions no longer carried the tension or bitterness they once did. One late spring afternoon, I found myself in the middle of painting a canvas that had been sitting blank for months. It was abstract, shades of blues and greens swirling together like ocean waves, and for the first time in a long while, I felt completely at ease, as though I were creating something just for me. My phone buzzed on the counter, pulling me from my thoughts. I wiped my hands on a cloth and glanced at the screen. It was Lyric. Her text was short but intriguing. "I have something to show you. Can we meet?" I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen. After all this time, I'd grown cautious of anything that felt too sudden. But there was a curious edge to her message, a tone I couldn't quite place. Against my better judgment, I replied, "Okay." "Where and when?" We agreed to meet at a park near my apartment later that evening. The air was warm, the first hints of summer brushing against my skin as I walked to the agreed-upon spot. Lyric was already there, sitting on a bench with a small notebook in her lap. She looked different, calmer, more composed. The storm that had once seemed to follow her everywhere had settled into something quieter, though I could still see traces of its aftermath in her eyes. "Hey," she said as I approached, offering a tentative smile. "Hey," I replied, sitting down beside her. "You said you had something to show me?" She nodded, holding up the notebook. "I've been journaling," she said, her voice soft. "My therapist suggested it, and I didn't think I'd stick with it, but it's actually helped. A lot." I blinked, surprised. Lyric had never been one for introspection, but here she was, holding a tangible piece of her growth. "That's great, Lyric," I said honestly. "What made you want to share it with me?" She flipped open the notebook, thumbing through pages filled with neat handwriting, occasional doodles, and a few pressed flowers. "I've been writing about us," she said, "about what happened and how I've been working to understand it. I want you to see that I'm not the same person I was, and I want you to know that I'm sorry, not just for what I did, but for how I made you feel, for how I hurt you." She handed me the notebook, her hands trembling slightly. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to dive into her thoughts, but something in her expression told me this was important, not just for her, but for both of us. I opened it carefully, my eyes scanning the first page. Her words were raw and unfiltered, recounting memories from our childhood, her feelings of inadequacy, and her jealousy of my success. She wrote about the guilt that had gnawed at her since everything happened and the steps she was taking to rebuild her life. One entry stood out, dated a few months earlier. "Elara was always the strong one, but I see now that I mistook her strength for invincibility. I leaned on her too much, took too much, and expected her to carry the weight of my mistakes. It wasn't fair to her. She deserved better from me, and I didn't give it to her. But I want to someday. I hope she can see that I'm trying. I hope she can find it in her heart to let me be part of her life again, not the way I was, but as someone better." I closed the notebook, my heart heavy but not in the way it used to be. Instead of anger or resentment, I felt something else. An ache, yes, but also a glimmer of hope. Maybe she really was changing. "Lyric," I said, handing the notebook back to her. "Thank you for sharing this with me. It means a lot to see how far you've come." Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her voice catching as she said, "I'm not expecting anything, Elara. I just wanted you to know." For a moment we sat in silence, the sounds of the park filling the space between us. Then, slowly, I reached out and placed my hand over hers. "I see you trying," I said, "and I'm proud of you for that. It's not going to be easy, but if you keep doing the work, we'll figure this out. One step at a time." She looked at me, her face a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. As I walked home that evening, I felt lighter than I had in years. Our relationship was far from perfect, and there were no guarantees. But for the first time, it felt like we were both moving towards something better, a future built on honesty, growth, and the cautious hope that even the most fractured bonds could find a way to mend. As the weeks passed, I found myself reflecting more and more on that moment in the park. Lyric's openness, her willingness to bear her vulnerability, had left a mark on me. It didn't erase the pain of the past, but it softened its edges, creating room for something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Cautious optimism. We began talking more, exchanging messages that were no longer transactional or defensive. Instead, they were simple, meaningful exchanges about our lives, her progress at work, my latest art project, a funny memory from our childhood. Each message felt like a small step forward, a brick in the foundation of a new relationship. One evening, she invited me to see the shelter where she volunteered. At first, I was hesitant. The wounds she'd left behind, though healing, were still tender. But curiosity won out, and I agreed to visit. The shelter was modest but warm, bustling with activity as volunteers prepared meals and helped guests find clothing and supplies. Lyric greeted me at the entrance, her face lighting up when she saw me. There was something different about her, an ease, a quiet confidence that I hadn't seen before. "I'm so glad you came," she said, leading me inside. "This place, it's been a lifeline for me. I didn't think I'd ever feel like I was doing something good, you know." but here, I do. As we walked through the shelter, she introduced me to the staff and volunteers, who spoke highly of her dedication. It was surreal, seeing this side of her, the side that was capable of giving, of caring for others without expecting anything in return. It gave me hope that her journey of self-improvement wasn't just a fleeting phase, but something real, something lasting. Afterward, we sat on a bench outside, the cool evening air brushing against our faces. She looked at me, her expression serious. "Elara, I want you to know that I'm not doing all this just to prove something to you," she said. "I'm doing it because I finally realized I need to, for myself." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. "And I'm proud of you, Lyric. I really am." Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment I thought she might break down, but she just smiled, wiping at her face with a laugh. "I don't deserve a sister like you, you know." I shook my head. "You deserve a chance to be the person I know you can be. That's what this is about. Not the past, but what you're building now." We sat there for a long time, talking about the future, not just hers, but mine as well. For the first time in years, it felt like we were on equal footing, two people trying to navigate their own paths while finding a way to walk alongside each other. The months that followed brought more small steps forward. Lyric continued her work at the shelter and started taking night classes to pursue a certification in social work. Meanwhile, I kept pushing myself creatively, taking risks in my career and finding new ways to challenge myself. We didn't see each other often, but when we did, it felt natural, unforced, a sign that we were slowly rebuilding something real. One day, as I was rearranging the shelves in my apartment, I came across the photo of us as kids that I had framed months ago. I smiled, running my fingers over the glass. It no longer felt like a relic of what we had lost, but a reminder of what we were working to create. A bond reshaped by time, struggle, and a shared determination to move forward. I placed the photo back on the shelf, my heart lighter than it had been in years. Whatever lay ahead, I knew we were both stronger now. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that our story wasn't just one of pain and betrayal. It was one of growth, redemption, and the quiet, persistent hope that even the most fractured relationships could find a way to heal. Time continued its quiet march forward, and with it came more moments of clarity and understanding, not just about Lyric, but about myself and the relationship we were rebuilding. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when old wounds surfaced, moments when I'd catch myself second-guessing her intentions or doubting whether we could truly leave the past behind. But those moments grew fewer, replaced by something gentler: trust. One crisp autumn day, I received an unexpected invitation from Lyric. She was hosting a small event at the shelter to celebrate a milestone: her 6-month anniversary as a volunteer and the completion of her first course in social work. She wanted me to come, not as a guest of honor, but as her sister. "I know it's not a big deal," she said over the phone, her voice laced with a nervous edge, "but it would mean a lot to me if you were there." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I thought about how far we'd come. This wasn't the same Lyric who had barged into my life and upended it without a second thought. This was someone who had fought to change, to grow, and to earn back the trust she'd shattered. "I wouldn't miss it," I said, and I meant it. The event was small but heartfelt. Volunteers and staff gathered in the cozy community room of the shelter, sharing stories and laughter over plates of homemade food. Lyric stood at the center, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, genuine, unguarded, and proud. When she spoke, thanking everyone for their support and sharing her journey, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This was my sister, not perfect but trying, and that was enough. Afterward, as the crowd began to thin, she found me by the coffee station. "I'm so glad you came," she said, her voice soft. "I was nervous you wouldn't." "Of course I came," I replied, meeting her gaze. "This is a big deal, Lyric. You've worked hard for this, and it shows." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "It's because of you, you know. If you hadn't stood your ground, I don't think I would have ever woken up. I don't think I'd be here." I shook my head. "You're here because you chose to be, because you did the work. I just gave you the push you needed." For a moment, she didn't say anything, and I could see her fighting back tears. "Well, thank you for the push," she said finally, her voice breaking. We hugged, a brief but meaningful embrace that spoke volumes. It wasn't a moment of complete resolution. Those moments rarely exist in real life. But it was a step forward, a confirmation that we were both committed to rebuilding what had been broken. As I left the shelter that evening, the crisp air biting at my cheeks, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Lyric's journey was still hers to navigate, but I no longer felt the weight of having to carry her. She was walking her path now, and I was walking mine, each of us stronger for the struggles we had faced. The city lights twinkled as I made my way back to my apartment, the familiar warmth of home welcoming me as I stepped inside. I set my coat down and glanced at the framed photo of Lyric and me on the bookshelf. This time, I smiled not out of nostalgia but out of hope for the future. Life would never be perfect, but it didn't have to be. What mattered was that we were trying, both of us, and that was enough. For the first time in years, I felt certain of one thing. Our story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and this time, we were writing it together. The months that followed felt like the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Lyric and me, but for the lives we were building separately and slowly together. Our relationship found a new rhythm, one defined not by obligation or guilt, but by mutual respect and cautious trust. It was a fragile thing, still in its infancy, but it was real, and that was enough. One evening, Lyric invited me to her apartment for dinner, a modest space she'd managed to secure with her own hard-earned money. I hadn't seen where she lived yet, and as I stepped inside, I was surprised by how much it reflected her growth. The walls were adorned with framed quotes about resilience and kindness. Her shelves were lined with books on social work and self-improvement, and there were small touches of warmth everywhere. Candles, soft blankets, and even a vase of fresh flowers. "This place suits you," I said, smiling as I took in the space. "Thanks," she replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "It's not much, but it's mine. For the first time, I feel like I've earned something for myself." Dinner was simple but heartfelt. A vegetable stir-fry she'd learned to make in one of the cooking classes offered through the shelter. As we ate, she opened up about her future plans, finishing her social work certification, finding a full-time position, and eventually using her experiences to help others who were struggling like she once had. "I used to think I was the victim in every situation," she admitted, pushing a stray noodle around her plate. "But now I see that a lot of the messes I ended up in, I created them. And fixing them has been the hardest thing I've ever done." I nodded, letting her words settle between us. The hardest things are usually the ones that change us the most. She smiled at that, her eyes soft. "You've always been good at saying stuff like that. It used to annoy me," she said with a teasing grin. "Now I think I get it." After dinner, we sat on her couch with mugs of tea, talking late into the night. For the first time in years, it felt easy, like we were two people who understood each other on a deeper level, unburdened by the weight of the past. We didn't pretend everything was perfect or that the scars weren't still there, but we acknowledged them and chose to move forward anyway. A few weeks later, Lyric called with more good news. She had been offered a part-time position at the shelter, working directly with families in crisis. Her excitement was infectious, and as she told me the details, I felt a wave of pride. This was the Lyric I always knew was there, buried beneath layers of pain and bad decisions. She had finally found her way to the surface. "Do you think Mom and Dad would be proud?" she asked hesitantly. I paused, then answered honestly, "I know they would. They've always wanted to see you happy and thriving, and so have I." Her voice cracked as she thanked me, and I realized how much those words meant to her. Lyric had always been searching for validation, for someone to tell her she was enough. Now, for the first time, she was beginning to believe it herself. As the seasons changed, so did our relationship. We began seeing each other more often, not out of obligation, but because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. We laughed over old memories, shared stories of our current lives, and even made plans for the future, like attending a local art fair or volunteering together at the shelter. One evening, as we walked through the park near my apartment, Lyric turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I used to think you were invincible, like nothing could ever touch you. But now I see that you're strong, not because nothing hurt you, but because you learned how to keep going anyway." Her words stopped me in my tracks, and I looked at her, feeling an unexpected lump in my throat. "Thank you," I said softly. "That means more than you know." She smiled, and we continued walking, the path ahead of us bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. For the first time, it felt like we were truly on the same page. Not as the Elara who had to fix everything and the Lyric who caused chaos, but as two women who had grown, stumbled, and found their way back to each other. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was good, steady, hopeful, and filled with moments of connection that reminded me why I had fought so hard to hold on to the possibility of something better. As we walked side by side, I realized that this wasn't just a new chapter for Lyric and me. It was the beginning of an entirely new story. One we were finally writing together,